Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Anita Fowler, and I apologize for a little lateness here. We were having some technical difficulties on the end of my guest, and we should have them resolved shortly. But until then, I just wanted to address some things and share with you what our focus is for this session. This is part two. There was so much information to share when talking about pastoral transition and a succession plan as an exit strategy for pastoral transition. Noting that a succession plan can be for an exit plan or it could be in regards to hiring a leader and not necessarily the pastor. One of the challenges that we find is that, what should I say, several questions have come up, and that is, are you prepared to lead? And are you prepared to leave? A succession plan is relevant in both situations, and that is how I came about with my book title here that I have is Leadership is a Choice, and it should be released in the first part of the year, 2024. Amen, amen, amen. And leadership is a choice in that there's a time to lead and a time to leave. And if you are like me, you'll find that there has been gaps in the leadership. Um, there's gaps in our leadership, and what I like to do is just be able to pause for a minute and bring our guest in. So stand by, if you don't mind. Give me 1 second. I'll be right there. Forgive us. Um, So I guess you'll be joining us soon. Again, I apologize, but it'll definitely be worth the wait. You know, when you're going live, you can anticipate some of these challenges. And so I wanted to just use this time to talk about how I came up with the title. Um, as I was watching in the pandemic, we had a lot of time to observe. And with my experience, I've been watching where sometimes it comes a point when um, there's either a leadership gap, and we need to identify the type of leadership style that we need, specifically during a transition. And in the pandemic, there were opportunities for a lot of transition to happen. Some churches closed and some churches open. And so succession plan came about that way. And then there were times where leaders needed to just have changed path. So that's why the question is the time to lead and the time to lead. Well, our guest is here, so stand by.
How are
Hi,
you?
I am wonderful. How is your day going? Listen, I know you're busy. I
It's
know
going
it.
well.
And I am grateful for this time. I didn't know whether to postpone you in regards to the book come out, but we promised the people a part two the last time we were on, and some people had noted that they were standing by for that part two. So thank you so much for making time for us again. We
Thank
are
you for the
grateful,
opportunity. I appreciate it.
and I know that you're busy, and we talked about. I just want to ask you. This is our Pastor Lamont Harris, and Pastor Lamont Harris is working is the administrative, strategic planning, and liaison for some of the ministries at the church. He's been with at St. Paul for well over 38 years. Am I correct?
Yeah, this year is 41.
Oh Lord, you can
Yeah,
retire twice. But obviously, you love what you do,
that's correct.
and it has definitely served the church well, I'm sure, in regards to the project that you just came through. And Pastor Harris was key in the pastoral transitioning to their present pastor. And if you can go back and look at part one, you'll hear a lot of the conversation. And this is part two, where we wanted to talk about leadership, leadership styles, um, and impact of leadership on the political divide side and the social and economic era that we're sitting in, and how to develop new leaders while uh, um, avoiding burnout, and the mental health part of it. So I'd like to just jump into the mental health part of it, Pastor Harris. Uh, Coming through a pandemic, you did several things. Number one, you worked on a transition simultaneously in a pandemic, pastoral transition, and the retirement of the previous pastor. So you had a full plate. So talk to me about some of the results,
Um, well,
feedback.
one of the,
Let's yeah.
so I would so the results of the transition.
The results of one, the transition, where you're carrying a lot. So let's talk about the transition. You look back, I'm sure there were some lessons learned or some things you could add or modify uh, in regards to onboarding someone, one in a pandemic, in a retirement, and it was your succession plan, whereas you knew who you were bringing on a year before, and you brought them on a year before. And so it's more
Correct.
like they served in the assistant pastor or executive pastor role, I believe it is.
Yes.
In the meantime, so just highlight some key nuggets, and then I really want to talk about the review part of it, the feedback part of it. Uh,
Okay. One of the things I would say is to be flexible. Our plan was for the pastor who came on a year out once our pastor announced he's retiring is to spend probably 2.5 days in our city and 2.5 days with his church so that he would have an opportunity to meet our leaders, meet the members of the congregation, meet the ministry and interface with the ministries. However, his plan with his church was to recommend someone just as our pastor had recommended him for us. So his church chose not to follow that path. His church wanted to go through a pastoral search process. And so because they did, and he loved his church, that meant he had to give more time to his church that he was leaving to come to us. He spent more time because the arrangement was he was going to preach twice for us, twice for his church as that transition occurred. So our plan in that regard, that did not come to fruition in totality. And so he was able to spend very little time during that transition period in our city and with our church. So the one point I would certainly share is with it, and that's a norm for any plan. You have to be willing to be flexible. And we respected that because he loved that congregation. He had been with them for a number of years, but once he felt it was the Lord's leading to come to our city, then that's what he did. However, the plan that we jointly put together, and we had to respect the desire of his church, so we had to make that decision and be flexible in that regard. And then once he got to our church, then he had to kind of hit the ground running because that year of transition that we wanted him to have to kind of make a handoff didn't really occur. So once he got there, then he began to set up meetings with the ministries and with the leaders, etc. So certainly I would think a key element in the transition is being willing to be flexible. And then also understanding that during that period, like anyone would probably recognize, you will lose some members. Then you're going to have some people that's coming because they're going to check it out to see, okay, how's the new pastor? What's going to be different? And at the same time, we were a year away from celebrating our 75th church anniversary. We're also, he also made the decision to work with a company to kind of help us to redesign like vision, mission, values, those sort of things. So we went through a year of that. So we kind of had some ministries on hold, and it kind of worked out because it was kind of like the middle of COVID. And during COVID, ministries probably were not meeting as regularly as they did prior to COVID. So that kind of worked out. So we were dealing with retirement of a pastor, transition in leadership, reorganizing the church, and then working with a consulting company to help us do that, and then being in COVID. So we had about 5 maybe moving parts going on, and we're a year away from the planning of our 75th church anniversary. So we kind of had about 6 things going on all at one time.
Wow. Yes, and that is why this question that says, "Are you prepared to lead?" Because all that you just announced right then, having a succession plan in place, having it in writing, knowing where you want it to go and where you want it to end up certainly allow for you to be flexible and
Hmm.
in a time when it was necessary and still not lose focus of the goal. So we talked about um, one of the questions I had is how do you how can we avoid a pastoral transition crisis, meaning that uh, more people, more pastors 45 and I believe it said 45 and under are retiring, or 50 and under are retiring sooner than the past generation of older pastors, and older pastors are retiring. Let me see. Let's see if I can restate that. The younger pastors today are retiring earlier, but the older generation of pastors are retiring later. And somehow or another, we're not able to recruit or gain more leaders in the time and how we're losing leaders. So the way they stated it was, it still seemed, it said at the moment, only 11% of black church pastors said they plan to retire in the next 10 years. Only 11%. But retirement plan begins to surface, and still only one quarter among pastors who have been in ministry for 20 years. Um, it says less than half of black church leaders over the age of 60 plan to retire in the next 10 years. But yet we have younger pastors who are retiring also in the next 10 years. So we still have more leaving than more the younger
Coming.
pastors leaving than we have older pastors leaving. So we're going to end up having um, that gap in regards to generational leadership is what I'm getting to. And it says if we don't have a succession plan in place and be able to identify some leaders, we're going to have what we call the pastoral crisis in regards to that. Um, and I'm thinking that to avoid that, your succession plan will help identify people early on. You guys did a targeted succession plan transition, but a succession plan can help you identify people sooner, even within the church. Um, Succession plan, what can be used to, as we said in our last session, hire or fire a pastor, because the succession plan is no longer stay in the position till you die, you know, or
Well,
can't
one of the
walk.
things that I think that I've kind of shared with, younger pastors, when I say young, can be, 40 on back, 45 on back. And when you go into a new church, and this is kind of revolutionary thinking, you go in letting the church know, I'm going to give you 20 or 25 years. So they already understand that, and you're operating with that kind of, whatever it might be, if it's going to be 15, 20, 20, whatever it's going to be, you're operating with that mindset. And that means you, as that pastor, you're giving great leadership, but the church knows, okay, you're not going to be here till 75, 80, or whatever the case may be. And I think the church itself, and it's great that you're doing writing the book that you're writing, as a part of its documents and governance procedures, should have a succession plan. Now, and that could mean here's the plan. It could also mean, though, that the pastor, and some pastors are starting to do it now, they've already identified their successor. So even if even if it's not written where the current pastor can identify the successor, at least there is a plan in place, and maybe it's talked about every 5 years. The other thing I would say that a pastor should probably do, coming in, is talk to your congregation about a sabbatical. And the sabbatical may be every 7 years, or, and if you're going to be there 2025, every 7 years isn't bad, because you're away for 3 months and they see, okay, you've had an opportunity, even if you're doing the first sabbatical after 7 years, to put a structure in place and systems in place that, yes, the church was fully operational and we move forward. So the idea is that putting more structure and systems in the church is what's going to help us through this process. And then, as you said, because there's this gap of younger pastors retiring earlier and older pastors maybe staying on longer, and there's going to be gaps. If you have structure and systems in place, even though you may not have a pastor, there still may be an associate minister or guest minister that you could have to step in, that's doing maybe some of the preaching and teaching. But the rest of the organizational piece of the church, it can still operate and function. And if you have, strong ministries that people are willing to give to, which all goes back to values of the church, structure of the church, organization of the church. Yes, we need a pastor, but all those things will help the church to move along if you're in a period without a pastor until you get one. So it's more about having a good, strong foundation. And if you have a period without a pastor, so even for all intents and purposes, when we were through COVID, our pastor was having some health challenges. So there wasn't a lot of daily kind of things he was doing. So I was doing much of that. So we still were able, obviously communicating with him, making sure, he's up to speed on everything. We're planning his retirement, but we still were able to move on and not lose much continuity. Because one of the biggest things that happens when you don't have pastoral leadership is a continuity of ministry, continuity of structure. Yes, maybe some giving may go down, but if you have strong, vibrant ministries that people are committed to and not so much committed to the person, then those still can go on. You continue to meet needs of people, make a difference in the community and all those sort of things. So I think, and then the other part is, I think just the churches now understanding the day is gone where a pastor is going to come in and like you said, a previous generation, you would hear I'm going to die in the pulpit. Well, this generation, and then the other thing, a couple of other factors. Many of them didn't have the opportunity for educational opportunities that the current generation has. Many of them were in churches. Now, we see a lot of the larger churches, mega churches, but the majority of pastors were in churches where they were not really compensated well because the church couldn't. They may not have had retirement plans. So in many instances, they're working longer because they had to. Now, many of the younger pastors, they are having opportunities to go to school, get educations. The church is sometimes paying for them. So now they're able to position themselves that they can put more into retirements. They can do because of their educational backgrounds, they're able to do other things outside of preaching. So they have some opportunities that previous generations didn't have. So I think that's a factor in there. And then they go in, because you hear many of them say, I'm doing this till 70, or I'm going to be here till 65. So they're planning that. Whereas I think previous generation probably wanted to, but two things. They wanted to, but weren't in a position to, or they were the mindset that I'm going to die preaching. That's going to be the last thing I do.
Well, you hit on several points, and this is what I'm saying. You've had the opportunity to live this out. And
Yes.
A lot of people are still probably discovering some of the things you've already crossed and created a blueprint for. That you talked about the succession plan. I love this idea where you talked about succession timeline. Like you bring in leaders and they're there for 3 years, and then they can exit and come back. But it's not like they're there forever, but they're able to, and then you can avoid burnout that way too.
And part of that is creating that kind of culture in church, because as we all know, some people, their whole values and their whole self-esteem and self-worth is based on this is what I do at church, and they don't really have other opportunities outside. So in our church, you have to create a culture where everybody's valued, but the downside of that, and these are great people, faithful people, but the downside of it is you don't give other people an opportunity. So you have to kind of figure out, well, how do I turn that tide and create a culture that, yes, we want you to serve, but the other side of that is, these days, as we learned when we were there at Howard, the younger generation, they don't want to be at a place doing something a long time. And if you're trying to give many of them opportunities, okay, I'll give you 2 or 3 years, then I'm out. And they might even be at another church, matter of fact, within 2 or 3 years. Those days of the same person staying at a church 30, 40, 50 years, at some point, those days. So all of those are shifts in our cultures. That's going to change. My grandmother passed 2 years ago. She was 103. She was a member of the same church for 90 years. The church that she got baptized in at 13, she never left that church. Now, this is in Mississippi. And when, it was a small rural area, but still, nobody stays at church that she never went to another. So my point is, people, they change and they're going to, and I think part of this is because of COVID and technology. I know a number of people, many people during COVID, they might have joined online another church. They're still a member of their church, and sometimes they might be a member of 2 churches locally, because that's what opportunity COVID created. So when we say, no, you have to come here, we might even have to change our thinking on that. So we can't even say, well, don't forsake the assembling of ourselves, what the scripture says. Well, we have a large portion of our congregation is very faithful with our online presence. They're very faithful givers. They're very faithful in their small groups. So we can't go around saying that anymore, because there are people who come, that's all they do, but they're not faithful in giving. They're not faithful in ministry or nothing else. And you got some that are online because of health reasons or personal reasons, and just for safety reasons, they're not coming to the building, but they're very, very faithful. So I guess part of my point with all of this is we have to recognize, shifts in the culture and society and shifts in a church culture. And I think in church is the one place where we just get comfortable and we keep doing what we've been doing because we're thinking is working. And if COVID didn't show us anything else, it showed us here's an opportunity to look at what you're doing, change it. And the good thing is if you mess up, it's not bad because there's no blueprint, because we've never been in COVID before we were in it. So, it's a learning process, and it still is a learning process.
Well, I think that is an excellent point in regards to how COVID was redemptive, like you said before, that allow you to look at some processes or some programs and some ministry that you had in place, what you need to keep and what you needed to pause for a moment if you kept it at all. And I think that is that is definitely having wisdom in regards to how the virtual aspect of church has appeared. How does so you just alluded to how the virtual aspect of church has changed how you look at membership, the virtual membership in regards to that, and it's still changing. Sounds like your thing in regards to how you communicate, how you consider virtual membership uh, compared to physical membership. But when we talk about leadership styles, I think that is what I was aiming at too in regards to this conversation is not everyone can walk into the space that you're leading, and the new pastor walking into a new church and actually just kind of be how do I say successful. It takes a certain leadership style. Did you consider a certain leadership style, or did you identify a certain leadership style in regards to what the church needed? Because I know you said you brought in a company that was able to assess the church, assess the staff, and assess the membership to be able to see
Yes.
what the church wanted. And so, did that enlighten you, or did you discover anything new in regards to what the church wanted when it came to leadership styles? Because I think that's something we don't consider um, when we're onboarding new leaders. We're looking at a lot of other characteristics, but in regards to what the church want and what the church need and how we assess that, spending the money to bring in an outside company who does nothing but this, how did that benefit you? And what would you suggest to other churches to make that a part of their process?
Well, two things relative to the leadership style of the new pastor. Well, our pastor before the current pastor is the one who brought in the outside consulting company. So I'll come back to that. But our previous pastor, this individual was a son of our church. He had worked there about 3 years. And then the church that he went to, they were actually had come to our pastor looking for a pastor. They said, well, what about Kenneth or him? And so that's how that happened, that he ended up at the church that he went to. So the church was already familiar with him, and he and the pastor had been talking. And so some of the traits that the pastor looked at in him was that he loves young people, because he wanted, and our pastor did. So as I listened to some of the things that our current pastor looked for, many of them were very similar to his own traits. Loved young people, took time and had compassion for our seniors, because much of our church had gotten older. Like the median age was like early 60s. And so you wanted to make sure that you had somebody that was not going to discard them or not consider them. He also wanted somebody that was solid, in doctrine and in the word. So those were some basic things that he was looking for. And then he made sure that he exposed him to the church, meaning that for a number of years, he would preach his anniversary. He would do leadership trainings for us. So the church knew him. So when I think of leadership style, it's very close, certainly differences in personality, but very close to the current pastor's leadership style. Now, relative to bringing in a company on the outside, our pastor said, he noticed and had observed a number of other churches, they had this consistency with, all their ministry logos, their messaging, their communications, their websites, their values, and how did they come up with this? So we were doing some research in terms of improving our website. And then we came across this company, Artistry Labs. And that's what we begun to work with. And so what Artistry Labs discovered, they're primarily a marketing company, but what they discovered was they can create great marketing packages for you. But if you don't have some other things in place in your church, it's not going to matter. So for example, what is your process when visitors come? What is your process when someone joins your church, they become a new member? What is the flow of your service? What do you do in terms of hospitality? Because they said a number of times they would put these great marketing packages together for churches and they'd spend money. Nobody came. They would call them back and they said, well, that's kind of not our fault. It's your responsibility to execute and to deliver on the package. So you can't say the church that loves everybody and people get there and nobody loves anybody. So that's how they came up with helping you to identify, well, what should your vision be? What should your mission be? What should your values be? What is your DNA of your church? So we worked with them over a series of meetings and included senior pastor, myself, our youth pastor, the person that's over hospitality, the person that's over new members, the person that's over women's ministry, so some key ministries in the church. And we just spend time looking at where we have been, where we were, and then kind of where we wanted to go. And so that kind of helped us to flesh out and identify all of those things. Then we looked at color palettes. We looked at designs of our logo. We looked at designs of ministry logos. And then we kind of created some pathways. So they helped walk us through all of those processes. So I do think that could be a benefit, and it's going to cost you some money, but I think that could be a benefit to any church. But on the other side, if your church has a strong knowledge of people with communication skills, strategic planning skills, assessment skills, it's almost something you could probably do yourself internally. So the benefit of someone coming from the outside is they're impartial, and all they're doing is taking the information that you give them, and they're helping you to think through and walk through, what you need to do in your setting. And this is what they do for a living. So I do believe there are benefits when you do have an outside consulting company. But I said, what I just mentioned, if a church isn't in a position financially to do that, if they have some of those resources within the church, they theoretically can probably accomplish the same.
That's true. That's true. And that's the way of identifying what you do have. That's one reason
Absolutely.
and the main opportunity for you to identify what you have in the church so you don't have to go out and pay money for it if you can't afford it. I think you've just highlighted why leadership styles are important in regards to bring you through situations.
Now, one other comment I would probably make in that regard is, even though the reality is, even though, our pastor shared with us, here's some leadership traits, and when it was presented, here's some things we look for, but you ultimately don't know until the person gets there. What their leadership style actually might be in terms of executing. So this is what we desired, and those were things that we saw. And I think that's the same thing that happens if you weren't doing a succession plan, you're doing a pastoral search. You you may talk to leaders at the other church. You're going to go visit the other church. You may you're going to do interviews, but ultimately, you can even ask very pointed questions, but ultimately, you don't know, because some leadership styles, you don't even see what it is until you're dealing with a different set of leaders. And I would suspect, he was in a different kind of cosmopolitan city. Ours is a little different type of city. So it's just based on, and then the people, because it's the personalities of the people that you're working with, that's going to dictate. So you may have a part of your leadership style you didn't even know that was there, because maybe in your other church, you weren't dealing with it. And this wasn't our case, with a lot of contentious people. And then when you first come in, people are checking you out. You're checking them out. You're trying to navigate the landscape, and you're getting to know people. So you really ultimately, in an ultimate sense, and that's why I think at the end of the day, much of this is spiritual work, meaning that, you really have to do your due diligence, but have a sense of peace that this is who God has brought here, and recognize that ultimately this is God's doing, because ultimately you really just don't know until the person gets there.
Wow. Yes, you're right. And having flexibility to be able to adjust and adapt, because it's not going to be perfect, but I can tell you it certainly benefits having a plan in place. I'm sure, having someone like
Always.
you who can navigate the process and adjust and lead the people. Because I believe when it comes to communication, like you said before, communicate, communicate, communicate. because a lot of churches lose people in a transition because of the time that it takes, because of who they selected, or how the selection process goes. So how does that how did you view the outcome in regards to the impact on the congregation itself in the transition? Was there any, or I mean, what would you the pros and cons?
I would say some of the cons obviously were related to being in COVID, because one of the things, we really couldn't do some things to celebrate and honor the leadership of our pastor in some smaller settings and a couple of more intimate settings. So because the intent was for him to have a gathering with the children or the kids, another gathering with the youth, another gathering kind of with the young adults, and then obviously the large one with the church. So we weren't able to do all of those because of COVID restrictions. So we did have the larger gathering out in the parking lot of our church, and that was a large public event. So we were able to so that was kind of a con. I think one of the other cons was, as much communication as we did, there were still people that said, well, I just didn't know some things that were going on. And we did a lot of communication. And I don't know that, so it's still a con, but I don't know what the answer to that might be. I think another con is there were some people that said, although this is the one that the pastor recommended, I would have liked to have had a process where we could have been able to have a say in who it was. So I think that's a con when you automatically just say, when the pastor says, and I think no matter what, the other side of that, no matter what you do, that's going to be the case. Because even if you
Yeah.
go the other way and you have multiple candidates, somebody's going to say, well, I didn't get the person that I wanted. But I would say the pros were having a plan, being flexible, our current pastor and incoming pastor also being flexible to work with each other. I would say doing all the communication that we did. And then I think we had a number of teams, and we made sure that we tried to have diversity on some of these teams that were a part of the overall transition team. So we made sure we got diversity of people on all those teams, and made sure, people just, we stayed informed with people, let them know what was going on. So I think those would be pros, those would be cons. Probably looking back on it now, I think maybe with the incoming pastor, I think because there was already these existing relationship, there were probably some hard questions that probably didn't get asked, that probably would have been asked if you had a pastor that you didn't already have any relationship or knowledge of. So I would say that no matter if it's someone that the current pastor is recommending, or if it's someone that, you're looking at a congregational pastoral selection search, no matter what it is, ask the hard questions. And I think because of the times that we live in, and this is for every industry and or profession, and you mentioned it in the beginning of our conversation, to talk about, mental health things in terms of leadership. Because I think in the days that we live in, mental health and what a person does to relax, what a person does to keep the balance, and making sure that that person has those things. Because like we were saying earlier, many pastors from previous generations, all they knew, study the Bible. They didn't have any hobbies. They didn't have anything else they did. Now I think it's getting better now, but you have to have a balance. And I think, and again, we kind of found that after we kind of got there, well, here's how long I would like to be here. So I think just kind of knowing all those things, and whatever pointed questions have to be asked, you ask them, and then you know what decision you're making based on asking your very pointed questions.
I'll tell you why this conversation is absolutely important. It's because as associate minister at my church, and when you consider the view from the pew, we are not behind the scenes or close up as I am right now having this conversation with you. So again, a lot of things that we see are a lot of things we don't see. And so we want to know, how can we best, as associate ministers, best help our pastor in regards to pastoring. I'm not saying everybody leads differently. The utilization of associate ministers versus the non-utilization, everybody have a different process, so that the pastor isn't taken on. I mean, what advice would you have to the pastor? Let me just put it that way, because you're close to the pastor, to in regards to utilization, to avoid burnout and to make people feel a part of. I mean, it's one thing to have uh, a slate of associate ministers, but how can they best utilize them? I think that's something where I'm looking at it from my um, view and seeing how things could help. The flip side of that question is, how can younger pastors um, how can younger pastors contribute to the process of being prepared to lead? That's what I want to say. And being prepared to lead, knowing what you know. Because I think the development of younger leaders, younger pastors, younger leaders, uh, is still a challenge. It's still a challenge.
So a couple of things. I think number one, that pastor has to let the associate ministers, associate pastors know his perspective on what he sees their role is. Some senior pastors, um, and many of the associate pastors or associate ministers, much of what many of them would like to do is to preach. And
Mm,
so that pastor needs to be clear to say, okay, my style is I'm doing all the preaching. When I'm not here, I'm going to ask if you have pastoral staff who are probably seminary trained, I'm going to ask them to preach when I'm not here to preach, or when I'm on vacation or I'm out, or I'm going to ask another pastor. So if I'm an associate minister and I hear him say that, and I'm really looking for my opportunities to preach, then I have to reconcile that with myself saying, okay, that means I'm not going to be doing no preaching here. And if that's okay with me, then that's fine. Then if that's the case, the next thing that pastor needs to do is provide other opportunities for the associate ministers to develop their gifts, because I think that's part of him shepherding them. So if it means that, okay, I'm going to meet with juvenile hall to create opportunities for our associate ministers to go there to preach. I'm going to the jail. I'm going to wherever I'm going to go, come to create out, because they're not going to have them here at our church because I'm doing the preaching or I'm inviting another pastor in. So I'm going to make sure that I at least provide opportunities for them. Then I'm going to make sure that I've sat down with them to figure out what's their gift, what's their heart's desire in ministry, so they're not sitting around waiting on me to croak and think the church is going to vote them in the past. I want to make sure they're clear about that, that my process is going to be, I'm going to nominate someone that may or may not be them. I'm also going to make sure that they're clear about, okay, you say you were called to preach. Now, what does that really mean? Does that mean, you could do many, many other things in ministry outside of sitting here waiting on your chance to preach at 11 o'clock, because that's probably not going to happen. So I think communicating that helps them to understand that, and then they can make their own decision accordingly. Whereas on the other hand, there's tons of churches that are looking for associate ministers because that pastor needs some extra hands to help him, and they very well may get many opportunities to preach. So that becomes a decision he has to make. But I think it's incumbent upon that senior pastor to let them know, here's what your role is going to be. Then once that role has been made clear to them, then I think that associate minister has a responsibility to prepare himself, meaning going to school. It could be Bible college, could be seminary. Many are could be maybe bivocational. Many just can't stop and say, I'm going to go to seminary, because they're not go to seminary full time. So I think they need to do that. And I think where it's appropriate, they need to be integrated into as many ministries in the church as they can, because that gives them some exposure on, here's what it looks like to lead ministry, to be engaged in ministry. And I think the pastor has to create those opportunities. The church structure has to create those opportunities. Then there's plenty of opportunities for them to teach, Bible study on Wednesday, or midweek classes for Bible study, or some of the online classes. Clearly opportunities for doing, participating in what happens at the pulpit. And I think the other challenge is it's an issue of numbers. So do you have 10 associate ministers on staff, and 99% of the time, when a pastor has a staff, pastors on staff who are seminary trained, one of the things he does is give them the opportunity to do that other preaching. And if I'm an associate minister, I'm not on staff, I'm not one of the pastoral staff, then that automatically eliminates me. So I think that's just a matter of looking at the numbers. And then I think they also need to figure out, do I fit here? Because there might be some place you are, it's just not the fit. But part of that, knowing that fit is, really what, beyond just preaching, what has God called me to do? Yeah, you called to preach, but what is he called me? Because at some point, after a couple of years, you get a chance to preach at your own church once or twice. You could get other opportunities outside, but you have to have been prepared yourself. And I do believe the scripture in Proverbs that says, God makes room for our gifts. And then I think
Yes.
the other piece is, which is what I've done, I clearly understand without a shadow of a doubt. I sit in the second chair. And when I say I sit in the second chair, only meaning that my role is to assist and support I have no delusions, no aspirations, no nothing for pastoring or leading a church. That was my role with my previous pastor. That's my role with this pastor. And I clearly understand that's what I was born to do, to assist and support the pastor. So that's the other piece. If that associate minister recognizes, well, no, I don't have aspirations for pastor. I know I've been called to preach. All I want to do is support the pastor, help move our ministry to where God wants it to be. And because, again, some associates, they're doing it because they would love to pastor a church, love the pastor to recommend them to a church. So if that's your aspiration, then, come up also with a plan. You and the pastor sit down. Well, here's a plan that what you can do to get there, but you don't tithe, you don't come to Bible study, you don't come to Sunday school, well, why would I recommend you to a church to pastor? But on the other hand, if you recognize, no, all I want to do, what God has called me to do is to assist and support. And there are a million things that a pastor needs assistance and support with, and understanding you may not be the closest person to him, because most pastors, they only have so many people, because of the nature of their work, because of the nature of relationships, that they're going to allow to be very, very close to them. So that's the other piece. You recognize that, okay, I'm not going to be as running. You may be, but then you probably won't be, recognizing what the nature of that relationship is. So those are just some general thoughts, that I would share in response to your question.
I think, listen, again, I think that some of the honesty that you have shared here is significant in regards to understanding what each one's role is. Because if that's not clear, there can be some disappointing expectations or lack thereof in regards to managing expectations. And so I think more of that needs to be clear. And it's the
One last
ownership
thing
of
I
both.
would say is this. I think the pastor should value the associate minister, because typically in African American church, the only person that's valued is the senior pastor, and the
Mm.
congregate, well, that's just a little associate, or so the congregation itself, for the most part, they typically don't value the associate minister. They may place a little bit more value on a staff pastor. So I think that has to come from the pastor, where he builds up the associate ministers. He encourages them, and he places them in front of the congregation and places value on them in front of the congregation. Because, again, most people from our culture, the only person that's important is the senior pastor, but he could not do all the things that he does outside of the help and support of the associate ministers, the pastoral staff. So I think it's incumbent upon him, for him to get the congregation to see and to place this value on those associates, so the congregation begins to grow to have the same value for them. Because, again, we primarily just value the senior pastor and thinks but he cannot do what he does outside of the help of others. So that was the last thing I probably would want to say on that for sure.
No, I think that's great. I look at the part of the development in regards to being an associate minister at a church is the responsibility or the task to either grow them to stay or grow them to succeed.
Absolutely. Well, I would say both. Grow them to succeed, and the succeeding may be when they stay, or the succeeding is to be successful if they leave, or to be successful if they stay. So you're absolutely correct. And he doesn't have to do all the work, but he has to put, again, a program or an associate minister's development class or program or ministry, whatever it is. So there's something very, very systematic that occurs to them. So if I'm an associate minister and I walk into your church, I know here's a monthly meeting. I got to turn in a sermon every month. I'm assigned to a ministry. I have to be doing whatever that dynamic may look like. I have to make sure I'm enrolled in seminary unless I've graduated or can continue ed class. But with me doing all of that, then that means I think the pastor should also make sure there's a sensitivity on his part to make sure that there's value placed on all of us as associate ministers.
Yeah, I think that I addressed that in regards to reading part of the or listen to the discussion. I don't know if it was Bonner or where it was on the platform that that a lot of young pastors are stepping out to pastor, young men stepping out to pastor, but they haven't been developed. And I'm just looking at it as as an opportunity to share in my book what can be done on both parties in, how we can, like you said, being very clear about the roles. And I think it's critical because older pastors carry that father patriarchal leadership role, And the
Mhm.
younger pastors don't. And you highlighted that not that they don't, it's just that they don't see themselves as the father patriarchal, role. So the role
Absolutely.
changes. And I think that when we come from a certain generation of leaders, we tend to look for the same thing. And I think
Mhm.
that we don't talk enough about the emerging generation and the changing in leadership styles that require, because we pretty much go in and just do the job. Um, Whatever it is we do, and call to ministry is not called to preach all the time, right? As
Right.
you said. And I think being more clear on what opportunities are there, I think having a process in place that help grow people, whether it leads to whatever discipline, and this is what I advise different ones that I talk to, is because of my background in strategic planning, is developing people to grow their gift, right? To grow in their gift and determining what that is. And we do a lot of things on the emotional spectrum, but there's that scientific approach where we use spiritual tests, the spiritual gift
Absolutely.
test, the shape test, and the leadership test. And so I noticed when I went back and listened to our conversation, that was what you had mentioned. Um, and even the process of succession planning is a scientific approach in regards you might provide a survey of questions to that individual to be able to better understand them, as opposed to just having a slate of people where you listen to them preach and you make a decision based on that, as opposed to providing a survey to the potential candidates and getting a better understanding of them. So the scientific approach versus the emotional approach, and having a process in place, I think is very beneficial. Uh,
Well, I think because we know more now, and because we had different levels of exposure, absolutely we should use every one of those tools. We didn't do it, but I would even say it wouldn't even be too far off that even if an emotional, your emotion, there's assessments um, to look at someone's emotional state. I mean, I think there's value to that because pastoring today is so, I mean, it's always been complex, but the more time goes, I think it just becomes more complex. And again, to your point, is much, much more than preaching. I think even the Myers-Briggs, I mean, whatever assessment that's available to us. So the idea of the scientific data, because what you're doing is the facts don't lie. And the thing about these tools and instruments is they are very, very accurate and they do not lie. And so, and people sometimes, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but typically when a candidate is looking for a church, it's just like somebody looking for a new job. You're going to get the best foot forward. And nobody's going to say any, you're going to call the chairman of their deacon board. You're going to call a trustee. They're not going to give you any disparaging remarks. They were this, they were that, but there's these other things. And I think that's the value of using these other tools is nobody has to say, okay, I have low self-esteem. I don't value other people. I'm very intimidated. I'm intimidated very easily. I don't like being around a lot of people. I may not come out and tell you that in an interview, but guarantee those instruments will tell us that. And by having that, I could even frame other questions in an interview to confirm and negate that. But as you said, and as you know, those tools are very, very accurate. So I'm a 100% opponent, excuse me, of using those kind of tools.
One of the other tools that has been recently that I've even I meet with a group of Black clergy women on a monthly basis with Dr. Joy. And one of the tools that we have all taken is the Enneagram assessment. So, yes, there was the Maya Briggs. The Enneagram assessment is just kind of look at you in regards to your value, your system, your characteristics. It's different from the Myers Briggs, but this looks at how you fit in as a team, the Enneagram one, like what you bring in and then how you fit in as a team. Uh,
Yeah, I've looked at that before, and one of the things we're in the process of just reorganizing and redesigning our staff. But one of the things I want to do actually is use that once we have all of our staff in, because that helps you putting teams together. And I even said the first time I was exposed to it, I said, "Man, this will be great for identifying ministry leaders." Because just imagine you get two Type A person that they're going at it with each other. You get two Type Bs, you don't get anything done. So with that kind of tool or assessment, you could match, in addition to the spiritual tools, you could match people together. That way you can get so much more accomplished with ministry, which again goes back to putting systems in place, using tools, and having structure, which all these things are used when I say the world, in the secular world. And for me, I am an advocate of bringing those appropriate tools into our Christian environment, because it would just help us be so much more effective in what we need to do.
You keep messing around here, Pastor Harris. I'm going to be looking for an opportunity to come in internship under you for about a couple of days here and there. Um,
You are absolutely welcome.
just to get some further insight. Well, we have been talking now for about 40 minutes, and I just want to say how grateful I am to you again. The and before I end this, I wanted to ask you about the seniors. How, in this day and age, in this time, and in general, is there anything that came to light to you in regards to? I know you identified who they were in the succession planning time, so they could be able to be considered as full memberships, full members. In regards to their age, they're taking the communion and so forth. So, and if they weren't there, it wasn't because they just weren't there. It was because of their either condition. But as seniors in general, what would you offer a listener? Uh, a pastor or a leader in regards to um, not isolating seniors and not isolating like the boomer generation? What advice could you share?
Probably a couple of things. One of the things that has happened in our church, and again, this is because we had a senior pastor. He was there 49 years. So, of course, you have people that have been there for that time and longer. So, we've had a lot of people that were in leadership, not 49, but a long time. So, one of the things we did was, create what we called coaches. And so, we have like a chair of a ministry, a co-chair, then a coach. So, the role of a coach is, if you've served in ministry before, but you no longer want to serve, we've tried to identify what are your strengths, what are your skill areas. So now that we get a new leader that's in, you can help us by coaching them either on a regular basis or in a particular area. That was one way, just in terms of allowing them to still feel valued and valuable. Our pastor also does, like as a part of our Wednesday Bible study, a quarterly luncheon with them. And then the other thing that we do, if you're 65 and above, we have what we call care callers. So everybody in our congregation that's 65 and above that chose to, we did it initially twice. They get a call once a month just to check on them. Hello, I'm one of our care callers from St. Paul. Just call and see how you're doing. Just call and check any needs that you have, et cetera, et cetera. Just wanted to pray with you. And then, when our new pastor came on, he's crowned or, selected or appointed about 15, 16 new deacons. And so one of the things that they've been tasked with is to make sure that those who are seniors that are on your list, that you are making regular, consistent contact with them. So many of them are, when I say isolated, only meaning that they're at home. Many of them do not have or chose not to have a lot of the smart TVs and the technology and those sort of things. So we're making efforts to stay in touch with them. And then we're also making sure we have a ministry called Retirees and Senior Adults that we put, financial resources in that ministry to make sure that we're supporting them. So those are some of the things that we're doing to keep them engaged. And then he's trying to create a balance, our new pastor, because we did, in our estimate, kind of lose that millennial generation like many churches did. So he's a younger pastor. He's trying to gain them back. He talks about them a lot, but we also kind of remind him, make sure you're inclusive of our older generation. And so we try to do things to kind of keep them encouraged. And for those that want to be involved, we try to create opportunities for them to be involved as well, for those that choose to and want to.
Wow. I'm going through these last ones quick. In regards to the political divide, what are you doing and what else could you do in regards to voter education? As you know, on the political spectrum, we have always been involved at the church in our community, but somewhere along the line there has been some disconnect. So it seems, and now since we're in the second civil rights era, what are you guys doing to your community in regards to just educating them, especially with the next election that's coming up? Now, we know it can be done in regards to voters' strength because Virginia just turned out and flipped they kept one house and flipped the other, and so it's not hopeless. Let me just say that. I don't want people to look
Absolutely.
at the situation and believe that we're in a hopeless situation. So tell us what's your church role? What are you guys doing and what do you offer as advice?
With all these conversations, I try to be very open and transparent. So our previous pastor was very, very involved. Is actually a leader in our community relative to social action. Social. I mean, he was looked at when if something's happening, they're calling him first. Even our public officials. I mean, he was this. That was the type of leader that he was. So our current pastor, he's not as engaged, and that's just his style. He's not as engaged or as involved in the community as our previous pastor was. So from that standpoint, we're not as involved. However, we make sure that when there are the elections, we make sure we provide all the information to our congregation so they can make intelligent decisions. We're a polling place. And we have, some public officials that are members of our congregation. So we make sure that they're getting us the current and relevant information. As I mentioned a few times within the last 3 years with our current pastor, we've had 1 or 2 of them have spoken, not to say which way, but they would explain things. And we'll do forums where we bring candidates in and allow them to make presentations. And then in my role, I still pretty much try to maintain the relationships with our local public, with our public officials, because I've been able to, develop them over the years. But it's just a difference in the style of leadership. So that's my answer. We're not as involved as we were because it's just a difference in the style of leaders.
Do you have a
Or
social
that
justice?
style. We don't have a social justice committee. We have what's called political action. And
Okay.
so they pretty much do the same thing. But
Okay.
right now, we also see a lot of our young adults. That's kind of what some of their interest is. So one of the things we've tried to do during, because some of them, we'll see them on TV in the Black Lives marches. So one of the things we have kind of said to them, that's fine. But one of the things you should want to do, why don't you get involved on the decision making end? So, for example, one of our members is a city council member. So I was telling a couple, why don't you go to the city council meeting? Why don't you get on some of the commissions? Why don't you get on some of the county boards? By doing that, you get behind the scenes to see how decisions are made, and you become a part of the decision making. Oh, can we do that? I said, absolutely. So most of them haven't followed through on it. We made arrangements for them to go to City Hall for a meeting. The city council member that's a member of our church, he was going to acknowledge them. They didn't show up. And this is not a slight against them, but my point being, part of what we've tried to share with them is the marching and all that's fine, but you have to be where the decisions are made and things. What makes things change is changing the laws, and then, so you have to be there, but get behind the scenes to see how these things are done. And so most of them, I think, one person is kind of taking this up on it. So we're trying to work with them in that regard too.
No, I understand. Again, it's an error, and again, it's leader specific. But irrespective of that, I know, having been an advocate, that if there's a policy that's affecting a member of your church who's in that community, I think that just when you have your forums, that those representatives and speakers understand what's important to your community.
Absolutely.
And that's
Absolutely.
why I think it's great that you guys are having the forums and platforms. The and more so even because of the banning of the book. So how do you see churches taking part in educating our next generation or our young children if they're going to continue to ban books across the nation? That's kind of where I really wanted to just ponder on. If you can't answer, now, it's just something I throw out there for the listeners: is what role can a church play in educating our children about history and about life in general?
I mean, I think you have to have opportunities where they are in front of the leader or the pastor or a leader within the church, one. And I think because much of their information today comes from social media. And I think as a part of it coming from social media, many of them have not developed what I would call critical thinking skills. So with those critical thinking skills, that would allow you to assess what you're hearing instead of just going with, oh, I heard this, so I'm going with it. So I think part of it is helping them in that regard, because it's going to be, social media is here to stay. And I think as church, we can't put our heads in the sand. And then how do we have dialogue? So I do think even the pastor or leaders in the church, just having a sit down with them, then here, unless you have teenagers and young adults in your house, you could be divorced from where they are and not be in touch or in tune with it. So I think leaders within the church have to be able to sit down with them, stay in touch with them, and you have to have an environment within your church where they feel like they can speak. So as an example, Wednesday night, we do a budget review meeting with our congregation. So we have a budget and finance committee. They put that together. We email it to the entire congregation. And then what we do after that is we have a meeting with any questions they want to ask. And then we come to the business and we just kind of vote on it. So a number of our young adults came to the market, and this was the second time in history. They came to the microphone. They asked their questions about certain things. They got answers. So that's the environment that you have to have where they feel comfortable that they're not going to get shut down. They don't feel like their question is stupid, that they can ask it in these public settings, because most of the time they can feel intimidated or they can feel fearful. So we tried to do our best to make sure that whatever question they asked, and we just didn't give answers so they could hear what they wanted to hear, but we also did it in such a way that they feel like they could ask it.
Listen, how old is St. Paul's Church in Sacramento?
We are 75 years old this year. This is our 75th anniversary.
That's right. You did say that. And I know St. Paul is in the heart of the community and where they established.
Say that again?
I said I know St. Paul is central to the community that it exists in right now, keeping the pastor staying there, even though he didn't retire, but he didn't leave, because people know him. And I know he have an influence in that community. So I could still consider y'all to have a strong influence because of his presence, And
absolutely, the influence is there. But I guess my only point was, like with every, from my perspective, what I see about all of them have a certain passion that's in their heart. So some are, political social justice leaders. Some are evangelists. Some are they build churches, get churches established, they go to the next church. And I just think with Pastor Williams, he was a great administrator, but he was also a political activist as well. Whereas our current pastor, great leader, great pastor, but that's not one of his other passions. But he does make sure we're involved, our voices heard, etc. So he may not be out in the front leading it, but he's going to make sure we're involved there.
No, and I really appreciate you. You don't know how grateful I am to be able to have a direct source. Now, when my book come out, I am going to put together a leadership summit. I'm going to have a panel of speakers in regards to the topic, and it's going to be under the theme of "Let's Go to Church." I want to talk about how this all impacts church. We can talk about leadership in every area. I really want to say I believe in having leadership in the church and contributing however I can. This is my question. Again, thank you so much. And thank you to our listeners out there. This again is Executive Pastor Lamont Harris. And you can follow me, and I will provide you his information. And stay tuned for my book that will come out in the early part of the 2024, and we can talk about it some more. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pastor Harris. I really appreciate it. Just stand by for a minute.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler, for the opportunity.